Hello and welcome to your final video on America 1920 to 1973, getting you ready for your AQA GCSE. So we're looking at the final unit, which is about post-war America. So that's going to cover the 1950s, 1960s and into the early stages of 1970s. We're going to be looking at the civil rights movement. We're going to be looking at things like the American dream, and we're going to be seeing how America has changed since the Second World War. So these are the questions that you'll be faced with. We talked about this in the other videos. If you haven't seen those, we've got Unit 1 and Unit 2 on there as well. Your first three are all based on interpretation. We're going to look at some of those at the end of this video, so feel free to skip to that if you want to think about how you answer those. Number 4 is really simple. Describe two problems, point, develop, point, develop. Number 5 is asks you about a group and how they're impacted by something across the course, maybe an event like the Great Depression. And then finally, the 2 bullet point question. So an example there, which of the following aspects of the New Deal was more successful? Was it economic or social? So that is what you'll be faced with in the America paper, in paper 1. And I want to start off with 1950s America. So after World War II, life in the USA started to return to normal. Whereas lots of women had worked and filled the jobs left behind by men who'd gone off to war, women began to return to their domestic life. So they went back to being wives and mothers. And we've got an example here that during World War II, women had been paid 2/3 of a man's wages, but that went down to just half of a man's wages in the 1950s. So that social change didn't last very long during World War II. As women return to being wives and mothers, we see a huge baby boom. So in the 1950s, there's a 40% increase in the USA's population. And that can often happen after a time of war because people start to feel more comfortable in bringing children into a world that is maybe a bit more settled, where there's a bit more peace. We also see in 1950s America a rise in consumerism. So luxury goods that have been available since the 1920s, like cars, they have another spike. So we have 56 million people, 56 million cars by 1956, and 90% of Americans have a TV in the 1950s, which massively dwarfs what we would have seen in Britain at that same time. And for many, this was seen as proof of the American dream, that idea that you can start off poor, but in America is a place where dreams can come true and you can rise to the top of society and create a comfortable, wealthy life for yourself. The president in the 1950s, one of the presidents, is President Truman. So he promised a fair deal for the American people. So he raised minimum wage, which is done by all of the presidents that we mention in this part of the course. They raised the minimum wage, and he also promises an increase in housing. However, the American dream is not experienced by everyone. 22% of Americans still lived in poverty by the end of the 1950s. And even more severely, for African Americans, that gap is even wider. Over half of African Americans live in poverty, and there is no national health service in America, so the poorest in society are suffering the most. The 1950s also sees a rise in a completely new identity, the idea of the teenager. Before 1950, the word teenager wasn't widely used at all, and people tended to become children and then they would jump straight to adults. Young people would leave school at 14 and they would be expected to work. Men would often start in careers at that point, whereas women would work just for a couple of years until they'd be expected to start families. Even though the education ended at 14, only 2/3 of children actually finished that compulsory education. Many stopped before then. But that starts to change in the 1950s because of a booming economy, parents aren't reliant on their children to bring in extra income. So as a result, teenagers start to have a huge amount more leisure time and also an increase in spending power. The amount that's spent by teenagers rises from 10 billion in 1950 up to 25 billion in 1959. And some of that money was spent on things like cars or fashion, music or alcohol. And it creates this idea that teenagers in America in the 1950s are starting to rebel against the traditional Christian way of life of their parents and grandparents. And some of the cultural references we see there, things like the 1955 film Rebel Without a Cause. It's James Dean where he's is committing crimes and behaving in a way that is very different from his parents. And we start to see what we call a generation gap, where teenagers are becoming misunderstood by their parents and vice versa. The generation gap was also widened by the rise of rock and roll music. Now, rock and roll is a funny mix between country music, which is from maybe more of a white background, and jazz, rhythm and blues that comes from a more black background, and a more of an African American background. And it was easy to dance to, and stars like Elvis Presley made it hugely popular in the 1950s. He was the most famous singer of his generation, and he moved in a distinctive way. And if we watch Elvis performing today, and it doesn't feel like it is particularly overly sexualized, but at the time, there were calls for him to be banned from the television. Older generations saw him as dangerous and breaking away from the American Christian way of life. That doesn't mean he wasn't popular. 82% of Americans watched one of his performances on the TV in 1956, a staggering amount. And because of his movements, he was pressurized to try and reform his reputation. He was pressurized to join the army in 1960 in order to try and make him seem more like the establishment, to try and bridge that gap between generations. Thirdly, I want to talk about McCarthyism, again, a 1950s issue. So McCarthyism is also known as the second Red Scare. And if you think back to Unit 1 and look at that video, we looked at the first Red Scare there. That was in the 1920s. It was caused by the Bolshevik Revolution, where communists took charge in Russia. And it spread fears that communism was going to spread across the world and reach America. In the 1950s, the second Red Scare is very much caused by the Cold War against the USSR. And it's really sparked by the man that you can see in the top right, a man called Joseph McCarthy, who was a politician who was quite low level, but he then became incredibly powerful and popular in the 1950s because he stated that he had a list of 200 names of communists who were working for the American government. Now, that list did not exist. He used this fear of communism as a way to promote himself, as a way to make himself more popular and more powerful. But it sparked fear across America that communism was coming. So for the next 5 years, McCarthy launched a series of investigations to track down anyone accused of communism. And millions of ordinary Americans were investigated by the House of Representatives for Un-American Activities, or HUAC. Some were blacklisted, like Charlie Chaplin, as you can see on the right-hand side. He had been the most famous film star of the 1920s and 30s, and yet he could no longer work in America because he'd been listed as somebody who was a communist. And the term McCarthyism is still used today. McCarthy became less powerful. He accused people in the army, and he lost a lot of popularity because we know how America feels about its army and veterans. So he fell away. But the term McCarthyism is still used today to describe the process of accusing an innocent person without any substance behind those allegations. Moving on to civil rights, a huge topic in America in this Unit 3. So the civil rights movement, as we saw last time, it has its roots in World War II. The Double V campaign is where African Americans are fighting against Hitler abroad, and they go, well, why am I risking my life for America if when I come back, nobody seems to really care about me? So by the 1950s, African Americans continued to be seen as second-class citizens, and Jim Crow laws enforced segregation between the races. Some of the key events that we'll see. In the 1950s, you have 1955, Rosa Parks sparks the Montgomery bus boycott. She refuses to give up her seat on a bus. That is the bit that you will have known since primary school, but make sure we know the next bit. As a result of her protest and her being arrested, it leads to a year-long boycott of the bus companies by African Americans. And the bus companies lose so much money in that boycott that they are forced to change their rules, and segregation on buses is made illegal. In education, we also see segregation made illegal in 1954. The little girl you can see top right is a primary school student called Linda Brown, and her case was brought forward. She was having to walk miles just to go to school because she had to go to an all-black school, and the NAACP brought that case forward and said it's not fair that she can't go to the local school, which at the minute is only for white students. So that made segregation in schools illegal. But we know that a lot of southern states were ignoring these desegregation laws. In 1957, we see the Little Rock Nine case, which highlighted that many southern states were ignoring the segregation laws. And the Little Rock Nine were that the army had to be sent in to allow them to get into school because racist mobs were preventing them from doing so. The Montgomery bus boycott, although most famous for Rosa Parks, also launched the career of Martin Luther King Jr. He was a Southern Baptist minister, and he had this key idea of direct action, which is any protest that rejects violence. And that has a massive impact on civil rights across the USA. Forms of direct action include sit-ins, where people would sit down and refuse to move areas, so sort of counters which only served white people. That would be a place where a sit-in might take place. Freedom rides, where people would be bussed into the South to try and test out whether these desegregation laws were being followed, and also marches. And the most famous of those is 1963, the March on Washington, where Martin Luther King delivers his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And direct action worked perfectly because when it's tied in with the rise of television, people across the world are able to see what is happening in America, and they see a group of African Americans or also white allies who are not using any violence but are being attacked by either police officers or by racist mobs, and it makes it very clear which side people should support. So direct action is a genius move in terms of the fight for civil rights. But not everyone believed direct action was the way forward. There were other campaigners like Malcolm X and other members of this movement that we call the Black Power movement, which didn't think that non-violent direct action was the way forward. They advocated for African Americans to achieve equality by any means necessary. So you have private armies like the Black Panthers who are encouraging African Americans to carry weapons to protect themselves, but also to seize power and equality for themselves. So in terms of talking about civil rights, we can't do that without looking at the impact of both John F. Kennedy and Lyndon B. Johnson, two presidents in the 1960s. So starting off with JFK, as we'll call him from this point on. JFK became president in 1960 when he was just 43, and it made him the youngest American president in history. And he cared deeply about civil rights. But as a Northerner, he regularly struggled to convince Southern politicians of his ideas. And remember, racism, as we've seen, is consistently worse in those Southern states. JFK talked of an idea of a new frontier for the American people. He wanted to make America a better, fairer place. He wanted to push boundaries. He's the one who says that Americans will go to the moon by the end of the decade, which they achieved in 1969, but they did that without JFK because in November 1963, as JFK was traveling to make a speech about the importance of civil rights, which he cared so deeply about, he was assassinated. We've talked at length in lessons about the conspiracy theories maybe behind that, but the official line is that he was killed by Lee Harvey Oswald, a man with communist sympathies. So when he was assassinated, JFK had his vice president was Lyndon B. Johnson, who we can see on the right, and then also in this picture. This picture is taken on Air Force One on the day, which is the president's aeroplane, on the day that JFK was assassinated. So Lyndon B. Johnson is immediately sworn in to become the new president. Now, LBJ, he prioritized moves and initiatives that JFK had supported. He felt he had a duty to deliver what JFK wanted. So he put forward ideas like a push for civil rights that he knew JFK had wanted to deliver. And partly out of sympathy for JFK, the public widely supported these moves, and LBJ was able to pass these through. His plans were called the Great Society. And as a result, we see huge change during Lyndon B. Johnson's time as president. A year after the March on Washington and JFK's assassination, they happened in 1963, the Civil Rights Act was passed in 1964, and that made it illegal to discriminate against people in employment and housing based on race. and also gender. In 1965, this was followed by the Voting Rights Act, and that removed barriers that prevented African Americans from voting. This meant that African Americans could suddenly elect their own leaders and start to really initiate change. Jim Crow laws are quickly out, and we see a huge increase in African Americans being able to vote. LBJ also passed Medicare in 1965, which gave free healthcare to the elderly and poorest in society. And that's something that JFK had been so desperate to pass, but it had been rejected by Congress. If we're wondering what happens to LBJ, by the end of his time in power, he's made a huge impact. African Americans in poverty had dropped from 56% to 30%, but he did not run for a second term in 1969. He decided to step away, in part because he had supported the Vietnam War, which was becoming increasingly unpopular in America. Our final thing before we look at some interpretation questions is feminist movements, and this takes us up to the end of our course, 1973. So after the war, the majority of women, as we've seen from the 1950s, they gave up their wartime jobs and they returned to being mothers and wives. And the media influenced this to happen, and the women who did remain in work earned 60% less than men. In 1963, we see the release of a book called The Feminine Mystique by Betty Friedan, who we can see pictured on the bottom right. The Feminine Mystique argued that for middle-class women, the home had become like a concentration camp. It used really strong language, and it said that women had to break away from just caring for the home, caring for their children and for their husbands. And this book became a huge international bestseller. Friedan went on to set up the National Organization for Women in 1966 to campaign for equal rights. And in 1963, which is a massive year for this part of the course, because you've got the March on Washington, you've got the assassination of JFK, you've got the Feminine Mystique being released, but you've also got the Equal Pay Act, and that made it illegal for women to be paid less than men for the same job. There were loopholes to this, so a female manager didn't have to be paid the same as a male manager, and those loopholes weren't closed until 1972. Also in 1972, unmarried women for the first time are given access to contraception. And then in 1973, we have this huge court case, which is still being deliberated and argued about in America to this day, Roe versus Wade, which legalized abortion. And these changes were and are criticized hugely by conservative Americans who feared that this would move America away from its Christian traditional roots. Some argued as well, so we've looked at people like Phyllis Schlafly. She argued that the feminist movements would just increase pressure on women, that women wouldn't have the responsibilities of being mothers and wives taken away from them. Instead, they would just have the responsibility of being employees added onto that. So that takes us up to the end of the course. The last thing in this America course is 1973 Roe versus Wade. And for your practice interpretation questions, these are big in America. This is sort of 16 marks. If you nail these, you're going to do really well on the paper. So I've got an example here. You've got interpretation A. I hope it's okay to read, and interpretation B. I'm just going to quickly talk through these questions. So interpretation A from this example, which is a Unit 3 example, is talking about 1950s America. And it is from somebody called Michael Ventura, who was a teenager during the 1950s, went on to become a music journalist. And from the 1970s to 2010s, he worked for magazines that specialized in promoting new styles of music. This is what he says. He says, the best thing about post-war America popular culture was rock and roll. In the consumerism of the 50s, buying rock and roll music gave all teenagers something new and set them apart from adults. Rock and roll belonged to the kids and only the kids. It gave them joy and freedom. The music started a sort of revolution because adults saw it as a threat. Teenagers loved rock and roll as it challenged outdated ideas about sex and racial mixing in American society. Okay, there's one interpretation. Interpretation B is from Frank Sinatra, who is a singer in the late 1950s. You'll know his songs in terms of My Way, I Did It My Way. So Sinatra was a world-famous, award-winning singer in the 1940s with thousands of young fans. This popularity popularity became known as Sinatra mania. However, by the early 1950s, his style of music was less popular and he lost his recording contract. This is what Sinatra says. When popular culture was taken over by rock and roll music, most people were horrified. Recording contracts were only given to those producing this brutal and ugly form of expression. It was performed by idiotic thugs and listened to by a few impressionable teenagers. I hated rock and roll's shocking sexual lyrics. This dreadful music created negative and destructive reactions in some young people and damaged American society. So your first one is a really simple one. It's how are they different? So you need to just be able to say in just a couple of sentences how these two are different. We start off by saying one of them can be negative, one of them can be positive. And that applies to pretty much every single question that you're going to get. One of them is positive about rock and roll, one of them is negative. Straight away, that's getting you a mark. Then you need to push it a little bit further and try and link it a little bit to the context you're saying. One of them is saying, A is saying that rock and roll was something new and exciting, that it had rhythm that appealed to young people. And you could try and link that a little bit to your knowledge as well. You could say that, and we know that it created a generation gap in the American society. And then whereas interpretation B is saying that actually rock and roll was very different, they agree on that, but actually was a negative thing in that it was ugly, it was brutal. It meant that that was the only type of music that was passed that got through in 1950s America. Okay, so there's your first one, nice and simple. How are they different? Secondly, we're looking at who has said it. So this is where we look at the provenance. And the question is, why are they different? So don't really worry about the stuff in the boxes. You're looking at who has said it. So I've said before, if I'm giving my opinion about the best football team in the world, I'm going to say Nottingham Forest. But the reason for that is because I'm a Forest fan from Nottingham. Okay, it doesn't make it true, but you have to know my background to know why I've said that. So for us, we're looking at this and going, why would Michael Ventura say that rock and roll is amazing? Well, one, he's a music journalist, so he recognizes the change that it made, that it was a drastic change, bringing together white and black music, country music and jazz. He also was a teenager growing up during the 1950s, so it's his type of music, it's stuff that he would care about. Whereas if we look at interpretation B by Sinatra, he is going to think completely differently because he's actually lost his recording contract because he's seen as old fashioned. He's going to hate rock and roll because actually it's not the type of music that he used to do. He's an old crooner. He's singing New York, New York, and that's not popular anymore because people want to hear about, they want to hear rock and roll music. They want to see Elvis Presley and his hips. Okay, final one is my favorite. We call it the rugby ball question in my lessons. It's which interpretation is more convincing, and we call it the rugby ball question because you've got to pick up a quote and then run with your knowledge. This is not about provenance. This is about going, what do you know that backs up what's being said? Okay, so you pick up a little quote, and I'm talking one sentence or a couple of words, and you say, I know this is convincing because. So for instance, if we're saying that rock and roll belonged to the kids and only the kids, you could talk about the fact it created a generation gap, that it's the rise of the teenager where all of a sudden they've got spending power to spend on music, and it's creating this divide where Elvis Presley is suddenly scary to the parents of these teenagers. When we're talking about Sinatra, of him saying that it was seen as shocking and sexual, we could talk about the fact that Elvis Presley had to go into the army to try and make amends for these movements that people saw as changing the American way of life and challenging these Christian values. Okay, so for that one, it's an 8 marker, so you need sort of 2 paragraphs, picking out at least 2, probably more, little bits of the interpretation that you can say are convincing, and you would do a paragraph on each of those interpretations. They are both true, remember, so you're going to say they're both convincing, but you'll definitely say this one is more convincing because of your knowledge. Okay, best of luck with your prep. Best of luck getting ready for your exam, and I hope these videos have served you well in getting ready for those exams. Best of luck, bye-bye.